Peak human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Peak humano.
Hello, everyone. It's time for another great guest on the Peak Human podcast. I'm Brian Sanders, the founder of Sapien.org, NoseToTail.org, and creator of the Food Lies film that I continue to work on daily while I do these podcasts and post daily on social media. You can check out clips from the Food Lies film, interviews, and other presentation I've done on the Food Lies YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking to the great Michael Crawford PhD. He's a storied researcher and has contributed a lot to our knowledge on brain development, human evolution, and marine foods high in DHA. I think the meat crowd needs to rally behind seafood a bit more and recognize its unique nutrients. He's a sharp guy for an older fella, and there's a lot to learn in this one. Dr. Michael Crawford is a professor and researcher at the Imperial College of London. He is part of the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Metabolism, Digestion, and Reproduction. He is a director of the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition, founder, trustee of the Mother and Child Foundation and the Little Foundation. His research focuses on the biological reason why docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, has been so unique in neural signaling for the past 500 to 600 million years of evolution, and application of the knowledge to prevent and treat neurodevelopmental disorder. To date, he has organized 22 international conferences on nutrition, brain development, and mental health. He also has an impressive list of publications I'll link to in the show notes. Before we begin, I want to talk about NoseToTail.org for a brief second. We have the new products that are almost impossible to keep in stock, especially the body care stuff. Flying off the shelves, it's a real testament to how great it is. Handmade by my business partner, Tommy. I did an episode with him about how he does it. He gets the beef tallow from regenerative farms near his home, renders the fat himself, uses only a few ingredients, and works his magic and gets them out to our facility to fulfill. Actually, our facility is where we do our biltong. It's a great South African guy that makes this stuff in the traditional way, but at good scale. We package it up fresh and ship it out so it doesn't sit around, straight from the facility in North Carolina. This stuff is very special. We keep the fat on. We don't need any of that lean stuff. We keep the good stuff on, the juicy, nutritious, and delicious fat. It's air dried slowly over 7 days instead of dehydrated quickly at a high heat like jerky. Uses no nitrates, no curing agents, no funny stuff. And it's really good. It's really great. Try the Drovors as well. It's a stick version and very good. We also have some seasonings. Tonight, I just had some nose-to-tail lamb, ground lamb with the tongue-tied seasoning in it. This is not what you'd expect. You don't expect to use some Thai seasoning in lamb, but it is so good. It's a spicy Thai seasoning in the ground lamb. You mix it all in, fry it up in a cast iron skillet with some onions, and then you get some sour cream, and you get the Dillon Ranch seasoning. And you mix that in with the sour cream. Add a little more salt on both of these. I don't pack my seasonings with a bunch of salt just to weigh them down and make them cheaper. I leave you to do the salting. And then you have the most amazing dish, the hot Thai flavored lamb with the cool ranch sour cream on top. Oh man. So get those seasonings, no fillers, no sugar, no funny business again. We also have hats with the giant steak on it or the nose to tail hats. And of course our meat, the primal ground beef with the organs mixed in. The best way to get liver, heart, kidney, and spleen in your diet without even tasting it, especially if you use the seasonings. We have all kinds of flavors of the seasonings and you can just add them into the primal ground beef. You'll never know there's organs in them, but you'll get all the nutrition. We also have the low omega-6 pork and chicken. This is what you want. You want the good omega-3s that's in seafood that Dr. Crawford's going to be talking about, and not the high omega-6s, which is in all the seed oils and all the normal chicken and pork that you get with a high omega-6 fat content. So we do a very special process. It's a proprietary feed. It's very expensive actually, and that's why the chicken and pork is a bit more expensive than normal. But it's the good stuff. It's raised well. We do it all in Texas from a ranch, ship it out to you. 10-pound minimum, 20 pounds and you get free shipping. And with all the other products, over $60, you get free shipping on those. They ship separately, by the way. We also have the Sapien program at sapien.org for people who want to make a big lifestyle change and lose some weight, reverse disease. We have Dr. Gary here. He has a medical practice in Los Angeles, and we do our program remotely, or you can come see him in person. We also have the Tribe, where we have our Zoom calls with Dr. Gary and I. We have our private members area. You get the bonus episodes of these podcasts. You get the extended show notes. Get all kinds of stuff. Been throwing some little discounts for nose to tail products there as well. I'll throw some more. Got to remind myself to do that. And that's it. This is how we make the podcast possible. It's all supported by our own whole food products that we believe in. No outside sponsors. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Thanks for sharing this podcast with a friend, giving it a review in iTunes. And now let's hear from the great, the legend, Dr. Michael Crawford. All right. Hello, Dr. Michael Crawford, calling in from London. How are you doing today?
Doing very well. You can just call me Michael if you like.
All right, Michael. Well, you're a great researcher that's been doing a lot of things for a lot of years. I've caught one presentation of yours online, and I also know that you've done some research with Dr. Cunnane and some other people. Do you work with Dr. Lee Broadhurst as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had her on recently. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your research career and your interests?
I worked in Africa for a number of years, East Africa, Kampala, Uganda, as a matter of fact, at the medical school. And there I was interested. The disease pattern in East Africa was totally different to the disease pattern in the UK. For example, commonest surgical emergency was for disorders of the intestine. And the commonest cause of death from heart disease was endomyocardial fibrosis. Now, these were nothing to like what we have in the UK or Europe or America. So it struck me that really what was different was the sort of food that people ate. So to cut a long story short, the work in East Africa that I did for a number of years clearly demonstrated the significance of food to the pattern of chronic diseases that a population suffered from. And so when I came back to London, 1965 or thereabouts, I was honored with a laboratory to start working at the Nuffield Institute of Comparative Medicine, and given a lot of money and told to set it up and do some research work at my choice. I puzzled as to what we should do, and one day it became clear to me that the cause of endomyocardial fibrosis in Africa was most likely due to chronic protein malnutrition. And we had experiments and published papers in the Lancet about that. Whereas in the United Kingdom and in the US, for that matter, it was apparent at that time, the story was, that the cause of atherosclerosis and heart disease was due to bad dietary fats. So on the one hand, you had protein malnutrition. The other hand, you had fat or lipid malnutrition. That's the way that I looked at it. But the idea of working on cardiovascular disease was just not on because there were too many people involved. Just out of the blue, I said, well, why don't we work with the brain? Because that's made of fat. Then asked the question, why was it in nature's last great experiment of evolution, with the evidence of which we see in East Africa, why was it that the different species had different brains in relation to their body sizes? So we then studied 42 different mammalian species. And what we found was that the chemistry of the brain was absolutely identical from one species to other, whereas fats in other parts of the body were totally different. That told me that the chemistry of the brain was inviolate, that it was highly conserved, which meant the brain had evolved in relation to the substrates that were required for its growth and development. And that it was a little bit like the tailor who cut his cloth to made the suit according to how much cloth he had. That here we had a situation in which the chemistry of the brain was inviolate. It was absolutely the same in every species we studied. It was the availability of the nutrients that were required for the brain. And these were fatty nutrients, and one of which was a fatty acid called docosahexaenoic acid. And that was highly concentrated in the signaling systems of the brain, and particularly the photoreceptor. And a friend of mine, Gene Anderson, in the United States, working at the Cullen Institute for Eye Research in Houston, He shown that depended on DHA, on this substance, and the photoreceptor was absolutely full of it. And we found that the synapses were absolutely, as the neurons were full of this DHA. And the whole point about that is that we now come to say, well, where did we get the DHA from? And the major, and perhaps really the only resource for a major concentration of DHA is in the marine food web. So that meant that evolution, the only way we could have evolved a big brain was making use of the marine food web. That meant we had to be evolving at the seaside, so to speak, making the best use of what was available in the sea and what was available in the land, because there's very little DHA, and we established this in the land food web. So that's how we came into the story.
It's so interesting because not a lot of scientists that I've come across have gotten into this idea, but the brain is made up of DHA. We've seen a lot of good studies and evidence of humans living in and around the shores and rivers, streams, everything. But I don't think a lot of people have put this together. It seems like the competing theory is, I guess, the savannah theory, and that we were just inland.
The savannah hypothesis is fine for a bit, but the point is that there really isn't support in the savannah food web for the brain. If you look at all the savannah animals, for example, you start off with very tiny animals like hyraxes and things like that. They have quite big brains relative to their body. It's about 2% of the body weight. But as you get bigger and bigger, the brain size diminishes, and you get to something like a rhinoceros, which has got about 0.1% of its body weight as brain. So what happens in the land food web is that as body size increases, brain size diminishes logarithmically. And that is a really critical issue because there's no exception to this. So how could Homo sapiens have evolved on the savannas? It's just impossible. It just didn't supply the stuff that was needed for the brain. It's as simple as that. It's like building a house. You've got to have bricks and mortar to build the house. And the same with the brain. You've got to have bits and pieces that the brain requires. And docosahexaenoic acid is absolutely required in terms of building the brain. And there you have it. It's not really available on the savannas. There are other things available on the savannas. Fine, you can get lots of good food. But when you stop and think about it, the brain largely develops before birth. About 70% of the adult number of brain cells have arrived by the time you're born. So what really is important is maternal nutrition, not these hunters and gatherers who charged out into the savannas and killed big animals or whatever. It's the mother that's important. And she can, with very little effort, wander around the coastline and help herself to food for free, which at the time, between 7 billion years ago and let's say 100,000 million years ago, at that time, the marine resources and the stuff on the coastline and the rocks and the sands and everywhere would have been unbelievably rich. And she would have had no trouble in having as much food as she wanted for free, a bit of effort in opening the shells and things like that, but not much. And she would have had this free resource of DHA-rich food that would have powered the growth and development of the brain before birth. And generation after generation, that would have enhanced brain size until it got to the size of 1.45 kilograms, which is the size of the brain of the people, the skulls they found in Herto in Ethiopia about 160,000 years ago. That's the biggest size that they've found in terms of the fossil evidence. And that's quite recent in terms of evolution. So it's absolutely clear this marine food web was the free, simply available resources with some wading and mucking about would have been freely available to nourish the mother at the time the brain was developing. And generation after generation, you would have this enhancement of brain development until we reached the size that we had when we stepped out into Fertile Crescent and started domesticating plants and animals 10,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so exactly. You're not saying that we didn't get animals and that animals on land aren't important. It's just...
That's right.
Yeah, and maybe you could talk about the consistency of foods. You're talking about generation after generation and these abundant seafoods, and all these different seafoods, not just fish. We're talking about crustaceans and mollusks and turtles, and they were always around. That consistency was very key because maybe we didn't get a hunt, but we could always have seafood.
Yeah, it was always available. I mean, the men could go off and hunt animals, and if they caught something, fine. But if they didn't, all this stuff was there to keep people full of wonderful food. And by the way, it's not just docosahexaenoic acid that's important in fish and seafood. Fish and seafood are also rich in a whole bunch of other stuff. Iodine, take iodine, for example. Today, there are about 2 billion people at risk to iodine deficiency. They all live inland. And iodine deficiency is the best well-known, historically, cause for mental retardation. Again, the marine food web is the richest source of iodine. Again, you can take copper, selenium, zinc, and manganese. Now, these trace elements are, again, richest in the marine food web. Mussels, for example, are one of the richest sources. Now, the reason why they're important is because the brain makes certain enzymes which uses these metals, these trace elements, to defend the brain against rogue oxygen atoms that escape during the oxidative processes. It defends the brain against peroxidation. And there are some people who view Alzheimer's, for example, as partly caused by peroxidation of the brain. So it's not just DHA, it's all this whole bunch of trace elements as well that are particularly rich in the marine food web. You see, the reason for iodine deficiency in the inland regions is very simple, that these trace elements get washed away, and they get washed into the rivers, and the rivers end up in the estuaries, and that's where the marine food web takes off in earnest. And almost certainly I would suspect that our ancestors, first discovered the wealth of the marine food web at an estuary where they would have both fresh water to drink and an abundance of fish and seafood.
Yeah, we were always around water. We know that because we need water to live. And so we were always after food. So I don't see how there's any real question what we were eating, that this was a great source of food. And humans were smart enough. We're one of the only species smart enough to probably figure it out. I mean, this was what other species? It was kind of all to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. David Attenborough has a lovely clip at the end of the TV program where he was giving a story about wildlife to commemorate Darwin's centenary or something of that sort. And at the end of it, he's hiding in the bushes beside a river, and he sees chimpanzees knuckle walking down to the river. And he sees them standing perfectly upright as they walk down the river. One of them is holding a baby chimpanzee, and they're walking perfectly upright as they walk down the river. And he whispers to the camera in his usual way. And this is how our ancestors took the first steps to becoming human.
Wow.
Walking down the river, finding the estuaries, and there were the seabirds noshing their way on all the stuff in the rocks and things like that.
Are you saying in the river, like their legs were submerged?
Yeah, their legs they were up to their waist, really, basically, in the rivers. And of course, that's one of the stories about that Lee Broadhurst would almost certainly have told you, would be that the reason for upright stance is, of course, wading. That would have led to the upright stance, wading and swimming.
Yeah, so the savannah theory talks about how it was to see over the reeds of the savannah or to see over the grasses or to carry a spear. But it's a reasonable hypothesis, but there's also this alternative one that makes a lot of sense.
The thing that I don't understand, that particular aspect of the story, there are two things about it. First, if you are throwing spears or have bows and arrows, then you're already smart. You're pretty bright. You've already evolved a pretty significant brain. That's point number one. The second is that actually if you've actually lived and worked in Africa, if you've been on safaris just chasing animals with a gun or a camera, the one thing you don't do is to stand up and walk about because the animals see you and run away. What you do to get too close to an animal, to take a good picture, is to crawl. And that's, of course, what lions do, and so do all the leopards as well, for that matter. They make themselves almost invisible by moving like a carpet on the ground to get as close as they can before they take off to catch whatever prey they're after. And the Aborigines, Darwin actually refers to this, the fact that the Aborigines, when they were hunting, he says in his book, they make themselves invisible on the land, crawling on the land to get close to the prey. So this idea of standing up to throw spears is a load of nonsense. Could only have been invented by people who had never done any hunting themselves.
Yeah, we could already walk on all fours and crawl. I mean, that was something we already could do. And you bring up a really good point about it's already too late. We were already smart. If we could already develop these tools, we need to focus on how we got so smart.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. And there's absolutely no doubt there would have been, let's say, a whole bunch of migrations from the coastal lines. Homo sapiens, or the ancestors, would have been, as we are today, inquisitive people. So they would have been wandering about up the rivers and taken off onto the savannas and so on. There's no doubt about that. There would have been many lines of humans evolving and doing things. And the one that came down to us and became Homo sapiens would have had to have had access to the marine food web.
Yeah. If you look at the timeline, the tools came a bit later and fire came way later. So we're talking more about 3 million years ago. I'm kind of looking at a graphic of this exponential rise in our brain size. And the tools come in, 2 million years. It's sort of, we're already in this big growth phase. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about, you talked about in the beginning about the DHA is necessary, but how it kind of goes hand in hand. I mean, no one knows, but did the food push or pull or both the brain growth? And were the other factors like communication and that kind of thing?
Oh, well, communication would, of course, come naturally as the brain size evolved. All animals communicate with each other in one form or another. Even bees communicate with each other. They don't even have a brain. So communication would have come quite naturally, and it would have got more and more complex as the brain got bigger and bigger and bigger. I think it's a fascinating thing that it's impossible really to draw straight lines through the fossil evidence. They keep on trying to do this, but it's absolutely impossible. And one of the problems with this is that the stuff which has been found as fossils is always on fairly dry land. That's because that's where they're best preserved. Whereas due to the melting of the last great ice age, much of the land would have been occupied by these coastal dwellers. There's a far away out to sea today. So we don't have much evidence for it. We do have some evidence, and that is the evidence, for example, at Pinnacle Point in South Africa, where there is absolute evidence of incontrovertible exploitation of the marine food web. They were clearly human because they had all the human traits of art and self-decoration and so on and so forth. And there they were, incontrovertible evidence of extensive exploitation of the marine food web. They also used the land-based food web, as we've discussed, but it's there. And this was the first real evidence of human appearing on the planet. That's about 160,000 years ago at Pinnacle Point.
Yeah, there was lots of shells or mollusk shells, right?
That's right. We saw. Shell middens.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's also, you showed a map in the one presentation. It seems like I could only find you one place online. I couldn't find any interviews or anything. So there's one presentation that I can link to that's on YouTube. But there's a map of our migration away from Africa showing that the shore base, I mean, you can get from Africa all the way basically to Australia in this U-shape, inverted U-shape along the coast.
Yeah, that was Chris Stringer from the British Museum. He published a paper in Nature a few years ago out of Africa, and he's presented very good evidence to show that Homo sapiens populated the planet by migrating out of Africa around the coastlines. They weren't sort of running around killing buffaloes and things like that. They were eating the fruta del mare as they went along.
And what was Africa like back in these time periods? I mean, this is a completely different epoch of climate.
It really depends on what time you're talking about, and Lee Broadhouse would certainly have been explained quite a lot about that. Much of this fossil stuff they've found in the Rift Valley, for example, was found around places where there were massive Great Lakes. Originally, the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aden was making its way to turn a part of Africa, split a part of Africa, right down the Rift Valley. But due to plate tectonics, all it got cut off, and you had this whole string of lakes, Lake Turkana, Lake Nyassa, and so on, around which many of the fossils have been found. And you need to think about Olduvai Gorge, for example, where it all sort of started. Olduvai Gorge was a river, and the river came from a very large lake. So they would have had access to these freshwater foods. And freshwater foods are actually also rich in DHA and other fatty acids that are important for the brain. And this is completely neglected by the people who transpose this evidence of finding fossils in the Rift Valley to being people on the savannas. They weren't on the savannas, they were around lake shores.
Yeah, Olduvai Gorge. Is that where we found Lucy? I know it's in Tanzania, and I'm going there soon.
Olduvai Gorge is, yes, Tanzania. Lucy was found, I think, somewhere in Kenya or Ethiopia, but she was found at quite a different place from Olduvai Gorge.
I was watching some video. I went down the rabbit hole of the Waterside Ape theory. There's all different names for it and different lines of thought: shoreside evolution, Waterside Ape, whatever it's called, Aquatic Ape. But I even saw something about Lucy, the sand she was found in. There was also alligator, crocodile bones, and turtle eggs and crab claws, and they found all this aquatic evidence in the same place. That's right.
So I said before, the plate tectonics all rose up, and it sounds very much from the evidence of there was literally sea stuff all around her, or sea or lake stuff, call it what you like. But there was certainly a lot of seashells and things like that in the locality where Lucy was found. That's without doubt.
It seems like scientists, I think this is always the case, is where people, they kind of get stuck with the main theory and it's hard to deviate from that.
That's right. It's a sort of great shame. Let's face it, we have Philip Tobias, who was perhaps the greatest living paleoanthropologist at the time he was alive, died recently. And he held a symposium in South Africa. It was called, I can't remember now what it was called, but it was a symposium with the Union of Biologists and Paleoanthropologists, in which about 2,000 people came. And at that symposium, he heard this story with Elaine Morgan, Lee Broadhurst, and a bunch of other people like ourselves, talking about this evidence that there was this link with the origin of Homo sapiens and the marine coastline. And he said, we throw the savannah hypothesis out of the window. And in an article later, these following words: we were profoundly and unutterably wrong.
Wow.
That's wrong about the savannah hypothesis. And, it takes a great man who, don't forget, he took over the chair from Raymond Dart, this guy who found, or he didn't find, but the guy who presented the town child to the world and the first evidence of human origins in Africa. And he has supported hypothesis of the savannah idea most of his life. And here he was at the end of his life, contradicting what he had believed up to that point. We were profoundly and unutterably wrong. It takes a great man to do that. I wish a lot of my others would do it.
It's really true. And it's hard to do. And it's hard for doctors. My business partner's a doctor, and he had to just swallow his pride and say, not everything. The things he taught about nutrition were wrong in medical school. And we have our biases too. I try to stay unbiased. My bias is that I believe animal foods are healthy and important, but I have no bias for meat and animals versus seafood. But it seems like even some people, I'm in sort of this animal-based nutrition community, and many people are really biased. They don't want to hear about the shore-based or seafood stuff because they're like, no, like we ate mammoth, like we ate steaks. I like steak. And I hope I don't do this too. It's like you kind of back into your ideas based on your preferences and what you like, and that's part of your bias. But I get it. Steak is delicious. And I wish it was as simple as all we did was eat a bunch of steak, but it's not. There's organs and there's bone marrow and we ate brains and then we ate seafood and crustacea. We ate all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, that's right. We were omnivorous.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, maybe I'm speaking to my listeners, the animal-based community, is that just don't think just because steaks are great and they taste good and they're fun to eat.
So are lobsters, for heaven's sakes. I mean,
yeah, surf and turf.
Lobsters are phenomenal food. Crabs, I think, are wonderful too. And a tuna steak, having a tuna steak that is sashimi, that's raw with a bit of, that's just wonderful stuff. I mean, yes, steak is great too. I love a good sirloin or a good bit of fillet. Absolutely. I have no doubt whatsoever that the land-based food web played an important part in our evolution, as well as the marine stuff. I think there's a really important distinction between the two hypotheses. It is this, that to be scientific, you need to be able to make a prediction and test it. Mm-hmm. You can't make any predictions from the savannah hypothesis. There's nothing in the savannah hypothesis that explains how we got a big brain. They say, it was competition with the big cats and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, that doesn't explain things in basic bricks and mortar. It doesn't explain how the brain managed to get the stuff it needed to grow. So that's the first point. Mm-hmm. The second point is that when you stop and think about what we're talking about the aquatic origin or food being important for the brain, that has a predictive value. Because what it says is that the marine food web was an important component of brain evolution to create Homo sapiens. And what that then says is that if you stop that, if you stop eating this sort of stuff, then you're going to lose your brains. And that, Ryan, is what is happening today. Because as you well know, mental ill health is escalating and is the most serious threat to the survival of humanity. It's totally logical.
This is something I want to talk about because a lot of people in my community, a lot of great doctors and psychiatrists I know, talk about this importance of DHA, iodine, just these animal foods for your brain. And I see so many vegan people or ex-vegans in my community that talk about how their brain wasn't functioning well and they had depression and other mental problems. And when they started eating salmon, for example, again, they all came back to life. Their brains switched back on and they lost all their symptoms of depression and other things like that.
There's a small problem with this, and that is that you get people doing trials with fish oils and things like that. But fish oils is not fish seafood. While some of them show benefits, there's a bit of controversy about it. But the reality is we've been losing cognition since 1950. And there's good evidence that brain size has been shrinking. This is not to say that we're not still pretty bright, but the reality is that if mental ill health continues to escalate this century, then you can predict humanity will be under threat.
Yeah.
I think it's a worse scenario than climate change.
I agree. And you brought up a study in your presentation. The correlation was 8-year-olds and the amount of seafood they ate and their intelligence, or sort of a think before acting, I guess, was a proxy for intelligence. It was ALSPAC study, ALSPAC. I can put in the show notes as well.
Yeah, the ALSPAC study, that was by Dr. Joseph Hibben, who's a great friend of ours. Published in The Lancet in 2007. It was the largest long-term follow-up study in pregnancy ever done. Over 14,000 pregnancies were followed. The children were followed up to 8 years of age. There was, without doubt, almost straight line relationship between the amount of fish and seafood the mother ate during the pregnancy and verbal IQ and behavioral scores of the children at 8 years of age. Now, that's fish and seafood. It's not fish oil, it's fish and seafood. And I think that is a really most profound study that tells us this is real.
Absolutely. And Lee Broadhurst brought up another amazing story about different tribes in Africa, I believe, in the last episode. So someone should, or anyone listening should go back to that one because I can't remember it right now. But I like this fish oil thing because I think we always screw up studies by trying to isolate certain nutrients. And it's not the real thing. We know that vitamin D is good and you get it from the sun and you get it from your diet and it's good. And if you try to supplement it, it doesn't always work the same. And it's the same thing with fish oil. It's not the same. Fish oil is not fish. There's so many different things that go on, and food is so complex in our bodies that just because some studies can say, oh, there wasn't any good benefits to taking a fish oil supplement, that doesn't mean a lot to me.
Well, that's true. I think the problem, we referred actually to the reason for this, and that is all these trace elements, just for one thing, is in abundance in the fish and seafood and not present to the same extent in the land-based food web. So fish and seafood is not just about fish oil. In fact, I can go even further and explain to you that fish oil is actually, there are two types of fat in the body. One type is the fat that everybody knows about, that we store around our waistline and other places. And we use it for energy. We use it as an energy store primarily. The other fat is the fat we use to build cells. All cells have surrounded by a membrane which keeps things separate from the inside and outside of the cell. And it's made of what we call, as scientists, lipids. These are basically what I call structural fats. The structural fats make up the bulk of the organization of the cell, all the little compartments inside the cell, the nuclear envelope. The nucleus is tied in a little ball surrounded by this membrane of essential fats or structural fats. The mitochondria that produce the energy for the cell is all organized by these lipid membranes that we talk about. The cell is not just made of protein. Its organization is dependent very much on these essential fats, these structural fats. Now, fish oil, to get back to that, is not structural. It's the storage fat. And the storage fat is composed of the fats that are left over from what you've eaten after your biology has chosen what it needs for all these complicated processes in maintaining and growing the cells and keeping them in good order. And your brain as well, by the way. People need to understand this fundamental difference between these two types of fat, storage and structural. And fish oils are storage. Now, look at the chemistry of the structural fats of cod muscle, for example. Cod muscle is where you have all these important membranes that are involved with the cell, both surrounding it, nuclear envelope, mitochondria, and everything else. And you compare this with the storage fats. Fish oil contains about 8% DHA and about 12% eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA. The structural fats of cod muscle contains, wait for it, 47% DHA compared to 8% in the storage fat. And there's very little of the other omega-3 fatty acids, the EPA, present in these structural fats in cod muscle. It is quite incredible, the difference. So that really tells you in a very clear way that eating fish and seafood is totally different to taking something like a fish oil capsule.
Absolutely. And my crowd is a very real foods, whole foods crowd. So this is just speaking our language here. Just eat the whole food and you can get what you need. So that's great.
I mean, the other side of the coin, Brian, is this, that if you take fish oils, they may do some good. I think they do some good. If you take fish oils and then you go and have a nosh up of one of these fast takeaway places that gives you this high fat, saturated fat, high carbohydrate type food intake, you destroy any good that the stuff could do you. It's a complex business, and it's not. What you eat is very, very complex.
Yeah, well, exactly. Especially the polyunsaturated fat. Well, that's the seed oils, omega-6s and deep fried stuff. I mean, yes, exactly.
Yeah,
You don't want
yeah,
those from the. So I want to go back to the aquatic ape theory or whatever, just shore-based evolution
okay,
idea, because there's so many interesting lines of evidence, and maybe it's not 100%. This all says that we evolved in and around the water, but they're very interesting, like
yeah.
the subcutaneous fat argument.
Yeah, that's another story. That's one that Steve goes on about, of course, Steve Koenig. He wrote that wonderful book, Survival of the Fattest. It's interesting that a newborn baby will float in the water and will swim. And on the other hand, we have to learn to walk. Now, does that not mean fall?
Mm-hmm. It's natural to swim. Yeah, I mean, babies float. They can kind of, yeah, I mean, they do fine. They swim, yeah.
They swim. I had this wonderful experience. This is a personal anecdote about my family. My daughter lives in New Zealand. When one of her children were born, I think it was Emily, I went out to New Zealand with my wife, and we went to the swimming pool one day. And Emily was only about 2 or 3 months old. So she said to me, if what you're talking about, all this business about babies swimming, Emily should be able to swim, surely. I sort of laughed and said, well, no need to try it. And so the daughters have great belief in their fathers. So Lindsay, my daughter, took Emily and popped her under the water. I couldn't believe my eyes. She opened her eyes and paddled under the water, paddled for some little distance, and then came to the surface and put her head on one side and took a breath of air.
Wow.
It's just unbelievable.
That's so cool. And we know that humans are one of the very few species that have that instinct to hold their breath.
That's
All
right.
other land mammals, they just breathe. They can't do that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's a group of people called sea gypsies, called the Moken. They live around the coast of Thailand and that part of Far East. And they've lived for as long as is known at the seaside. They have houses with in protected bays with the stakes that hold up the houses buried in the sand and this kind of thing. These babies are born in the water. These people live by the sea. They eat the fish and seafood, and the babies are born in the water, and they wean themselves by swimming down to the floor of the sea and picking food from the floor of the sea. They then learn to walk on land at 4 years of age or thereabouts. This is a sort of, if you like, a residual fossil of Chris Stringer's out of Africa around the coastlines. It's there for us to see, and these people. It's quite incredible. They have the most unbelievable, incidentally, they have extraordinarily good eyesight that enable them to see some tiny things that you can't even see with goggles, but things that can be eaten.
Yeah, people should look up videos of they're living like half in the water. They're almost like an aquatic species. They're just in and out of the water and they're diving around. And back to the eyesight, I mean, you started off talking about the importance of DHA, seeing in, what is it, just the glands, whatever makes us see.
Yes, photoreceptors and the synapses. Photoreceptors, synapses, and neurons are just something.
From 600 million years ago. The earliest photorecepting, wasn't it made of DHA?
That's right. A friend of mine, John Sargent, who studied the chemistry of the dinoflagellate, which has an eye spot, and that eye spot can actually see as well as photosynthesize. So it's very interesting. And not only was this eye spot, the dinoflagellate rather, rich in DHA, but also it contained a very unusual molecule because there's a molecule which has two DHAs in it. And interestingly enough, your eyeball and my eyeball has got that same molecule in it, a molecule with two DHAs in it. It's quite incredible. And if you look at the chemistry of the photoreceptor in fish, if you look at the chemistry, and the fish date back to about 450 million years ago. If you look at the cephalopods, which sort of come next, then there's the animals that walked on land, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. Chemistry of the photoreceptors of all of these range contain this di-DHA and are extremely rich in DHA itself. And the chemistry is the same throughout the whole range of this group of species, which dates back to 450, 500 million years ago. And this is the most extraordinary because, you see, there are two molecules which differ from DHA by only two hydrogens. That's all they differ by. But they were never used in the photoreceptor. So DHA has got an absolute claim to be the molecule that is required for photoreception, synaptic function, and neurons. And it's 500 million to 600 million years old.
Wow. It's important stuff.
Powerful stuff.
I kind of forgot to go back to this. The game changer. We're talking about there was no big game changer to cause the brain to expand except for DHA. We could always get animal foods, right? I don't know what people say otherwise. Like, what was the big game-changing nutrient that we ate that caused us to diverge?
I really can't think of any other nutrient that could have played this role. It was, in a sense, the missing link, because if you like, the reptiles before the mammals had very tiny brains. The mammals, the big mammals, as I've already pointed out, have not got very big brains either, but they're bigger than the reptiles. And that was, the reason for that is, of course, placentation. And I can tell you a story about that, because placentation is retaining the egg rather than laying the egg. And the process of retaining the egg that led to the evolution of the mammal would have been exercised by molecules that stimulated adhesion of the egg to the mother's womb. And the molecule that does that best is a derivative of arachidonic acid, which is present in meat. And it's an omega-6. And interestingly, it is derived from linoleic acid, which is present in the seeds of the flowering plants. Now, when the dinosaurs collapsed, the flowering plants took off in earnest. And we had then, with the origin of these flowering plants in abundance, we had a new chemistry entering the environment. We had these omega-6 fatty acids entering the environment. And it seems to me that it's highly likely that the key to the development of the mammals, the sticking of the egg to the ovum instead of excreting it, that the key to that was actually arachidonic acid derived from the linoleic acid of these abundant flowers, the seeds, the protected seeds of these flowers. So there you have a very good reason for the importance of the land food web. But what was missing was quite clearly this other side of the aspect of biology, which was required for the signaling systems of the brain. And that's where DHA came into the story. And if you want, possibly, this is, I'm not sure whether this is trivial evidence or not, but if you want to think about this, that not long after the occurrence of the mammals in large amounts, and the occurrence of flowering plants in large amounts, and so on, not long after that, mammals started enjoying the seaside. And then they became fully committed to the marine environment, one species after the other. That started 50,000 years ago and ended about 7 billion years ago. Now, why did they go into the sea?
Well, it started 50,000?
Started 50,000 years ago, which is not that long after the collapse of the dinosaurs, which was about 60,000 years ago.
Million, you're saying thousand?
Did I say 7? Yeah, million, 60 million years ago. Yeah. Not long after the collapse of the dinosaurs, very soon after the evolution in abundance of the mammals. You had the whales to begin with starting. These were land-based animals, decided they wanted to go back to the sea. Now, why did they do that? Now, when you look at the brain size of the land-based mammal, if you take the common dolphin, it has 1 kilogram of brain. If you take the lion, which is a big land-based carnivore, and the dolphin's a carnivore, the lion's only got about 250 grams of brain. And if you look at some of the other animals, the fin whales got 13 kilograms of brain. 13 kilograms. It's unbelievable. It's in a huge body, admittedly. But the dolphins get up to some quite scary sized brains. And if you can look on the web, and what you can find in the web are pictures of comparison between the dolphin brain and the human brain. And when you look at those pictures, it is scary. The extent to which those brains have evolved is just phenomenal. So there you have it. Why did land-based mammals go back to the sea?
It's good nutrition in the sea.
Well, it had to be the brain.
Yeah.
They had to make decisions. Of what makes the decisions? It's only the brain that makes decisions. It's not your big toe that makes the decisions, it's the brain. Their brains had to be saying, we want to go back in there because of something our brains want and need. And now you have the only comparable evolution of the brain in the marine environment.
Yes, the mammals, we're talking about the different brain sizes and their body sizes.
Yeah.
And the standouts are the humans and the dolphins. We're the outliers, right? We are the outliers with the giant brains.
So are all the marine mammals.
Exactly. Well, and like you said, the whale. Well, the whale is so big anyway, so maybe they're not as good of a ratio. But I mean, they have giant brains. You said
to get to 13 point whatever it is kilograms of brain, you've got to have a lot of building materials, whichever way you want to look at it.
Well, you know what's interesting too? You brought up in the lecture the Homo Heidelbergensis.
Yes,
say that right? Had a big brain, but not a big frontal cortex.
Well, if you look at the skull of Heidelbergensis, it has sort of got a flat skull. It doesn't have the big prefrontal cortex that we have as humans. So whatever was going on inside the head of that, they could have been very bright. I don't think any reason why they weren't very bright. I don't see why not, but it just so happens that we've still got, shall we say, Neanderthal genes in us, so we mixed about a bit with them. But the interesting thing, of course, was that Heidelbergensis was a very inland creature, as opposed to what we're talking about.
They didn't get that DHA.
They didn't get enough DHA. You can actually get DHA from the land-based food web, but modern intensive agriculture has more or less got rid of it. I mean, things like birds' eggs, for example, are quite rich in it. Otherwise, the bird can't make a brain. I mean, small mammals can make DHA, as I made the point, but the more protein you put into the system and the faster the body growth, making the DHA just can't keep up. And you look at the chemistry of these things, that as they get bigger and bigger, they're obviously putting on more and more protein, but they can't keep up with making the DHA. And so the proportion shrinks until it's almost negligible. And then you have these tiny brains, like the buffaloes, rhinos, and lions, and so on. Even chimpanzees, for that matter, they're not big. They've got 350 grams of brain, but it's really a long way from 1.45 kilograms of Hertoman.
Yeah, and we still get some. I mean, if you get good grass-fed meat, it does have some, but it's just not the same. And also, people listening will know we had a phase of scavenging throughout history where we could get into the brains of the animal, which has DHA. So we could get some DHA.
That's bullshit. Have you ever tried to open the skull of a buffalo?
Not personally.
Well, you should try it someday.
Maybe not a buffalo. What about the smaller animals? I've never heard anyone.
You could do that with some small animals. They talk about Homo sapiens killing all these big things. But the small animals, you could do it. Yes, there's no question about that. But the size of the brain is pretty tiny. I mean, we're only talking about a few grams.
Well, okay. So scavenging, maybe if there's a deer, ancient zebra type thing, we could get some. Or even just these land-based people now, there's some people that live more inland, they can still get some DHA from land-based foods, like you said.
If you take, for example, the Hadza from Tanzania, they kill and eat hyraxes, and they've got DHA. And some of the small birds, things like that, and birds' eggs, they've got DHA. These are good land-based sources. But there's nowhere to achieve the abundance of what you get from aquatic shorelines. You just can't do it.
Well, absolutely. I'm kind of agreeing with you where I'm saying that was the game changer throughout evolution.
Yeah.
And we maybe started to scavenge some animals way back when we were very primitive, very close to our primate ancestors. And maybe we got some through bone marrow or brains. And then, but yeah, what was required to really have our exponential growth. So
That's right. And don't forget what I said earlier, that it wasn't the men who were charging around the savannas with their spears that were important. It was the mother. The mother wasn't going out on these. She may have done from time to time. The girls may have done as well, but it was the mother with her children that was the real person that you needed to be concerned about. If the men caught something, fine, but she would have no problem wandering around the coastline of the lakes or the seaside or the estuaries and getting as much food as she wanted with all the rich stuff that's important for brain growth. And by the way, don't forget that we're talking about tropical Africa. If, for example, they got the brain out of a hartebeest skull, which would be easier than a buffalo, but still pretty difficult. If they got the brain out, the brain would, at the heat and temperature of the savannas, it wouldn't survive for very long. They wouldn't be able to put it in their pockets and take it home to the women.
They did eat it on the spot. Again, I'm thinking of more of just way back when we were just primates, basically swinging things around and trying to crack things open with a rock. And that's all we could do. But you're very correct. I've read a lot about this recently, about the women, pregnant women with the small child, just collecting food. And that was seafood. A lot of people, just because we observe the Hadza now and they have a different environment and they collect different foods and they have to rely on tubers, that doesn't mean that's what happened throughout history.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that one of the problems is that people see the coastlines today and they're pretty barren. But, in my lifetime, I grew up in Edinburgh and we used to go down to Crawford. My father used to take us to celebrate something, and he was a good fellow for celebrating any excuse. And we went to Crawford, which was in the mouth of the River Armand, the Firth of Forth. We used to go down there because the proprietor would go down early in the morning and collect the seafood and have it fresh for dinner. My father loved this fresh seafood. In 1965, I came back from Africa and said to my brother, who still lived in Edinburgh, let's go on a trip down memory lane and go to Crawford. It was July, a lovely, lovely day, and of course the sun sets late in up there. And we went down to Crawford and parked the car and then walked down to the shore to have a look at this wonderful iron bridge that spans across the Firth of Forth. There, straight in front of us, was a yellow notice of the Department of Health. Danger. Mussels unfit for human consumption. The Firth of Forth was killed in my lifetime. And that's part of the problem of people today. They look at the seashores and they can't understand how rich they all were at one time.
It's sad, and 100% agree with that. And we should go back into these other lines of evidence of just humans living in and around the shore.
Yeah.
We stopped with subcutaneous fat, and there's other reasons for subcutaneous fat and why. But one of them is just similar to other sea mammals and sea creatures. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. I think everybody should read Stephen's book, The Survival of the Fattest, because it explains all this in great detail. Stephen Cunnane.
Yeah, Stephen Cunnane, yes. I met him at a conference, and I haven't been able to get him on the podcast. I don't know if he wants to do interviews. Maybe we could recap some of his work because he maybe won't come on the show. But there's a subcutaneous fat, and the vernix is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's another story. I don't think it's got much to do with Stephen. It is an interesting story. David Attenborough hosted a 2-part radio series called The Scars of Evolution. The first part, he interviewed Elaine Morgan. And Elaine Morgan has written these books all about the aquatic ape, so to speak. And because she wasn't a scientist, all these savannah people just poo-pooed, and they really ripped her to pieces in the most unpleasant way without any actual scientific reasons for their ripping to pieces. And she kept on, I knew her quite well eventually, and she kept on saying, I wouldn't mind people criticizing what we're talking about, as long as they provided some kind of clear-cut evidence that was against it. And they never do that. They just use invective. And that was very true. Anyway, we had a lot of invective on the thing, one of the doyens of the savannah hypothesis, who was editor of the Journal of Human Evolution, said, "What do they mean? Putting their toe in the water? This is ridiculous." There's a kind of put down. And it's a sort of level of their incapability of coming up with a scientific reason against the aquatic hypothesis. However, David ends up the series. Interestingly enough, after the first part deals mostly with Elaine, and the second part, he opens by saying, things are beginning to change now. And one of the reasons is the brain. And so he interviews me and so on. We talk a bit about it. But at the end of that season, he says this: I had this thought that babies are born covered in a layer, fatty sort of waxy layer of vernix. Now, I don't know of any land-based animal that is born with vernix, certainly not the primates that I know about. I wonder if the marine mammals are born with vernix. End of story. He leaves it hanging there. So a while later, I was talking to a great friend of mine, Tom Brenner, who was at that time at Cornell University. He's now down in Houston, in Austin, Texas. Well, he's a world-renowned mass spectrometer expert. And we discussed this. And so he said, well, a good idea to go and have a look at these vernix, see if there is vernix in any of the marine mammals. When David ended the story, he said nobody knew anything about vernix in the marine mammals. But just before the end, program was going to go on the air, a professor from British Columbia said, oh yes, the harper seal is born with vernix. Every time I handle them, the babies, my hands come away covered in all this waxy stuff. So Tom then got 3 samples from 3 different marine mammals of vernix and put them through his mass spectrometer to test the possibility that they were quite different to human vernix. Well, they were the same.
Wow.
And I think that is pretty compelling evidence for some kind of connection with a common habitation of the aquatic region. Not necessarily, don't get me wrong, I have no suggestion, and I'm not making any suggestions that we were like dolphins or anything like that. This is one of the sort of put downs that these people get up to. It was basically making use, like the mokan do, of the marine food web. And it would involve swimming and diving and mucking about in the water quite a lot, which would have brought, perhaps they even got round to having their babies in the water. You never know, like the mokan do. So it's absolutely, the vernix story is absolutely fascinating.
It is. And I mean, a lot of people these days choose water births. They have them in bathtubs, and it's a very natural, easy way, apparently. So there's a lot of these stories with the vernix and the subcutaneous fat, like other aquatic animals have, the hairlessness.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we're not saying these are all direct lines of evidence that show one thing or another. There's just a bunch of things that add up that just suggest certain things, and it could be cause or effect, right? Like you said, it just might be this, that by eating this certain food, this does this, or we're not saying we're dolphins.
That's right. But funny enough, this all started, well, I don't know if it all started, but it certainly started in earnest with a paper by Alistair Hardy in the New Scientist around about middle of the 1960s, in which he argued the title, I think, was something like, was man more aquatic in the past? And he makes all this point about the upright stance, the fat, and he talks about also the sweat, because we sweat and lose water. Now, we certainly wouldn't be mucking about the savannas if we sweat and lose water, because I can tell you, we measured our water loss on the savannas of East Africa, and it was 1.5 liters an hour.
Oh, man.
And funny enough, the Israelis measured it as well for their desert warfare stuff, and they found the same thing as 1.5 liters an hour of water loss. So really, the savannas are not very hospitable so far as an animal that sweats like that. Most of the land-based mammals, funnily enough, are poikilothermic, which means that the temperature rises during the daytime and fall at night. They don't lose water like the way we do. So that persuaded Alistair Hardy this had to be some reason why we were not on the savannas and were certainly making use of aquatic resources. And he was told by all the head boys at Oxford, or whatever it was, he must never write about this sort of thing again or he'll lose his professorship.
Sounds like what's going on these days. If you don't follow the narrative, you'll get censored.
That's right. Incredible.
Wow. What is it other than just being around water so that you could replenish all that fluid we lose that points to us, the aquatic part? Is there anything sweating that beyond that?
Thing, yes, the eccrine glands, they are very important, of course, in maintaining water. And Philip Tobias, funny enough, put his finger on it, which sort of almost answers all the things he said. Wherever our ancestors were evolving, they had to have water to drink. That's absolutely true. So we had to be close to water. That's just incontrovertible.
Mm-hmm. So the bipedalism, that's like what you're saying is originally with the primates walking in the river. What about the hairlessness? Do you think that's a compelling argument at all?
Well, I don't know about hairlessness. It's just one of those things that Alistair Hardy came up with and Elaine Morgan used as well, because most of the marine mammals are hairless. So it would seem that a strong relationship with water would produce hairlessness.
Mm-hmm. Another one, I don't know if he brought it up. I just jotted down some notes. So I don't know where these are all from, but the shape and the direction of nose for diving.
Oh, there's a whole lot of that. Yes, there's stuff that I don't know anything about, but there are people who talk about that and exostosis in the ears and things like that, which are evidence of diving. But I'm not an expert. I don't know about that, and so I wouldn't want to talk about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The exostosis are interesting. I read about that. There's a guy, Peter Reese Evans, or he's a ENT. Right. Yeah, he's like a ear, nose, and throat doctor, and he kind of got into this. And these little bones that come out when you surf or swim or dive a lot, some people call it surfer's ear. And I just read a little excerpt from his book talking about they found these, I think it was Neanderthal remains and skulls that had evidence. About half of them had these exostoses. So it's just interesting that you only develop those if you're diving and spending a lot of time in water. So
that's right.
I guess we've covered it all. I guess we've reached the end of yours. I don't want to have you comment on stuff that you're not studying and all that. But just one more idea I had was the water could be a pretty safe place when we were leaving the trees, right? So part of the savanna idea is that we left the trees and we went out into the savanna, but there were all these predators there.
Yeah.
I feel like just going to water, not only for drinking water, but it seems to be a pretty protective place.
Yeah, I think David Attenborough, I think, had it absolutely right, watching these chimpanzees wading down the river. Even the chimpanzees, people with such little brains as they have, are really pretty inquisitive creatures. They're quite bright, actually, as it happened. Their inquisitiveness would have taken them exploring, and they would have ended up. It's easier to walk down a river than it is to walk up a river. And they would have ended up at an estuary and they'd have seen the seabirds noshing away, enjoying themselves. And I'm quite sure that the leader would have said to everybody, say, hey guys, we don't have to climb trees anymore because there was the food all on the land. And so I think that's what happened. And probably the timing of it would have been what the geneticists say about 7 million years ago. The interesting thing about that, of course, you need to think about what we talked about earlier, about this migration of land-based mammals into the sea. That all ended, I think it was the dolphins were the last, that all ended about 7 million years ago. Is this a coincidence that the richest food resource on the planet, would it be left empty? Nature exploits every single ecological niche, from, the fleas on the ice, for heaven's sakes, to the desert rat and the Arctic fox, so on. You find nature exploiting the most almost inaccessible and unrealistic ecological niches as long as she can find food. To leave the richest food resource on the planet empty doesn't make sense. And it would have been very reasonable to suppose that our ancestral primates wandered down a river and did exactly what I suggested, that they saw the seabirds noshing on all the seafood and they stayed there. And that's how it all began. That's my theory.
I'm in. I like it. And yeah, we could get their eggs. We get the seabird eggs. There's so many sources.
So much. The thing is, yes, we're reaching an end, but I'd like to put this to you. As I said earlier, the hypothesis we've been talking about has a predictive value, that there was a food system which enhanced generation after generation brain growth and development until we became intelligent enough to make sense of noises, speak to each other, and become Homo sapiens. Today, we're suffering from escalation of mental ill health. In 2005, the European Union did an audit of the cost of health throughout the European Union. And believe it or not, the costliest burden of ill health throughout Europe was brain disorders of the brain. It cost something like 386 billion euros. Everybody says, oh, it's just new diagnostics. It's all clever psychiatric stuff. They did it again in 2010, and the cost came out at 768 billion. When we knew, of course, what was going on in Europe, and we asked through a friend of mine and Lord Morris, the ex-Labour man, to ask a question in the House, what was the cost of mental ill health in the UK? And Lord Warren, who at the time was speaking for the Ministry of Health, said, oh, we didn't know about that. We did know about the cost of drugs in hospitals. And the cost of drugs since 1992, this was about 2007, the cost of drugs in 1992 had gone up fivefold when it was last estimated in 2002. So give the department due credit. They decided to do the numbers. And in 2007, Joe Nurse from the Department of Health presented the data. The cost of mental ill health in the UK was 77 billion. This is a cost greater than heart disease and cancer combined, she said. Now, again, everybody said, oh, so just clever diagnostics. They did the numbers again in 2010, and the cost had gone up to 105 billion. The Wellcome Trust came into the story, and it's the biggest medical charity, one of the biggest medical charities, and they did the numbers. In 2013, it came out at 113 billion. If this increase in mental ill health continues to rise, the logical conclusion is we lose that which made us human. We lose our brain. That's the end of humanity. And we've really got to wake up, because nobody's talking about it. This is the most serious threat to the sustainability of our species ever. And the answer is very simple. We need to recognize the food system has gone funny. We need to restore the food system to the kind of image that powered brain development over those thousands of years of evolution to where we were at the beginning of this century. We need to restore the supply of the marine and aquatic food webs. And we need to do this by developing agriculture in the seas. That is a solution which not only would help restore mental ill health, but could actually help to enhance brain evolution for future children, so that they became more intelligent instead of less intelligent. And the other beautiful thing about it is developing food from the sea, using kelp, for example, as a starting point. You're also fixing carbon dioxide. So you're also challenging global warming.
It sounds pretty win-win. It also takes burden off the land from producing so much food.
Yeah, and it takes burden off freshwater resources, because unlike the thousands of gallons that you need to produce a kilogram of beef, you don't need water for producing a kilogram of salmon.
Are there methods of doing agriculture in the sea?
Yes.
We don't want farmed fish. So is there natural?
Yeah, I just discussed this with the Japanese government in 1990. And the Japanese have now got an extensive Yokohama, off the coast of Yokohama, they have between two islands an extensive development of the sort I'm talking about. You know that we have grass pastures for cows and sheep. Well, Dr. Takahiro Tanaka, who's running this system, has got grass pastures in the sea for the fish, for the vegetarian fish. And he's got 7 target species of fish that he has worked for, after doing a lot of research, of course. For these target species, they studied the ecology, and they have developed artificial reefs tailored to the needs of the ecology of each different species. So they now have artificial reefs throughout the deeper waters, and these artificial reefs are planted on the seabed. They're quite large, and they're variegated in relation to the needs of the different species. For example, I can't remember which species it is, but one of them like to bury themselves in holes in the rocks. So he's got artificial with lots of holes in them, that kind of thing. But they then get clothed with the marine flora. And that clothing by the marine flora starts the marine food web. And the marine food web starts making food for the fish and all the rest of it. And they have tripled fish productivity in the area, whereas in surrounding regions of Japan, fish harvests have been falling. And not only that, they have, of course, oysters, mussels, and all the rest of it growing as well. It's a complete new dimension in the production of food.
Wow, that's really great, because I've been really into regenerative agriculture on the land, right? And raising cows properly and using rotational grazing and all these better methods and keeping them on grass. But it sounds like we can do the same thing for the sea. So maybe we can get behind this, get the community behind this as well.
Yeah. And the beauty about it is you then start repopulating places that have been denuded because of the movement of the way that things happen with urbanization and so on and so forth. You give new life to the fishing villages, you give new life to the coastal people. And not only that, you would have to develop a new industrial revolution to service it.
I'm in. Let's make it happen.
Yeah, let's make it happen.
Well, I love it.
It's the only way, Brian, that we're going to get enough food to feed the population growth that's going on at the moment.
Well, it makes sense. There's so much ocean out there.
Yeah.
It's sort of an untapped resource in a way. I know it's obviously we do a lot of fishing, but still it's an untapped resource to do a better version of.
Brian, the fishing that we do is Neanderthal stuff. It's hunting and gathering. 10,000 years ago on land, people gave up the hunting and gathering system because resources were diminishing. We have to do the same with the sea.
But not ruin it in a bad way.
Well, that's right. You've got to clean up the pollution and all that kind of stuff. That goes without saying. And indeed,
we'll just do it in a sustainable way. We did do this agriculture, but we did it in a bad way. We're just mining the soil and using all these monocrops and chemicals. So we can't do that to the sea.
That's right. Well, we can learn from our mistakes.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad you sort of woke us up to all this, and I think this is really great stuff. I'm guessing you eat a good amount of seafood yourself?
Yeah, we have a wonderful fish shop, fishmonger, just around the corner from our house, French, and we get superb fish and seafood from him. And we perhaps have a fish or seafood meal about 4 or 5 times a week.
Well, that's great. I need some better seafood. I do eat a lot of oysters and like full cod livers and sardines. Get a lot of sardines.
Yeah, I like a good steak from time to time. I'm very keen on occasional liver because it's full of the B vitamins, which are difficult to get from other places.
Well, you're in the right place. I got a liver crowd. We're into liver. Oh, yeah.
Liver and onions. Liver and onions is really nice.
It's a lost art. Liver and onions is a thing of the past, and we're trying to bring it back here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's really what we've been talking about. That we have to get the best from the land and the sea, from the two resources. But the trouble is that they've really mucked up the land-based food system with this intensification.
Yeah, exactly. Let's best of both worlds and do it right.
Chicken used to be a big source of DHA. It no longer is.
Well, yeah, it's not eating the right diet. It used to eat sources rich in, I mean, if you're eating a native diet of little grasses and bugs and worms, then they would have the DHA. But
yeah, they eat a lot of green stuff or things that eat green things. And green stuff is the original source of the alpha-linolenic acid, which is the precursor essential fatty acid that eventually gets converted to DHA. But it's a long way from alpha-linolenic acid to a whole lot of biological steps that are time-related before you get to DHA. So, small, as I said earlier, these small mammals with a high metabolic rates can make DHA, and chickens can make DHA. But if you don't give it to them, don't give them the precursor. They don't do because they're being fed on corn or some kind of mash that doesn't contain any. How can they do it? They can't.
Exactly. And yeah, people know that we're sort of against the vegan diet around here, but you can't convert. The humans don't have a great conversion of ALA to DHA. It's very small and it varies from person to person anyway. And that, yeah, you have to eat sources that are preformed. And
yeah, I like to use the analogy of building a house. That you can build a house with building bricks, or you can build a house with prefabricated walls. Which is going to get built faster? The one with the prefabricated walls. And this is the same with biology. For the growth and development of the brain is growing so fast inside the mother, and even after birth it's growing at a hell of a rate. Believe it or not, inside the mother it's consuming 70% of all the energy that the mother transmits via the placenta to the fetus, which just illustrates how much energy, the priority that biology gives to the growth and development of the brain. And there you need prefabricated stuff without question.
yeah, that's why, I mean, people try these days to be pregnant and vegan, and it's just not good. I heard some countries are more against it than others and say that it's unfit for a pregnant woman to be vegan.
Yeah, but the problem with the evidence as far as vegetarianism is concerned is that the vegetarian communities are the ones, like if you go to India, for example, that have the highest prevalence of low birth weight and the consequences to mental health derived from low birth weight and preterm birth. There isn't a good answer through epidemiology for the reproductive system behaving well under vegetarian conditions. By contrast, you take the Japanese and other fish-eating nations, and you see the complete opposite, with extremely good birth weights and brain development and high IQs.
Well, yes, I wish we could have better science. We kind of listed a whole bunch of different ways to look at this using epidemiology and the biochemistry of DHA and brain development. So we've kind of hit it from all sides. So knowing all that we've talked about, I think that epidemiology is pretty decent.
Yeah. Well, I think, let's put it this way, Brian. I think we know enough now to take action to prevent our children and their children being born with lesser IQ than is prevalent today. We know enough to stop that. We know enough to actually enhance the ability of the children of the future who are going to lead the world. Leading the world with a bunch of dumbasses is not a good idea under the present circumstances.
I think we have to go out on that note. That's a good message. It's perfect. It's a great message. Let's not make these mistakes. Thank you so much. Do you even have any sort of place where people can find you, or are you just doing your own thing these days?
I'm just doing my own thing at the moment. I'm in lockdown, of course.
Okay. Well, so we won't give you your Snapchat out or your TikTok. You don't have a TikTok?
Oh, no, what?
Okay. TikTok is a new app people use.
I don't know about that.
I would hope you didn't. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think the audience is going to love this one, and take care.
Yeah, you too. Take care, Brian. Let's save the world.
All right, there's another one in the books. Thanks so much for sharing. Thanks for giving a review on iTunes. Thanks for supporting us at Sapien. You can go to sapien.org and find out about our program, find out how to be part of the tribe, get in on the ground floor with us, be a part of our community. This is an extra close community where we hang out, we actually know each other, we talk and learn from each other and get healthier and all that good stuff. Sapien.org and nosetotail.org, where you can get all these amazing products for Christmas. You can still get them in time for the holidays. All right, that's it. See you guys next week.